What is more important in the history of the development of human civilization, sex or violence? So mating strategies or military strategies?
Oh, well, both are important. I mean, first of all, humans are a sexually reproducing species, and so everything has to go through sex. So in our mating psychology has to be very rich and complex because to succeed, for us to be here now, all of our ancestors in an unbroken chain have had to succeed in selecting a fertile mate, attracting that mate, be mutually chosen by that mate, stay together long enough, do all the sexual things you need to do to reproduce, have the kids survive, etc. So everything has to go through mating. And in that sense, I think it's, survival was really only a means to an end, if you will.
But well, let me just like to linger in terms of disorder. What about genius? That sort of cliche saying, like the madness and genius, that they kind of dance together. What about if the thing we see as disorder is actually genius, unheard or misunderstood?
Yeah. Well, here again, the numbers help us. And here's where being rigorous and quantitative actually really helps. If you look at disorders like autism and bipolar disorder and eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, for example, these, particularly bipolar and anorexia, these can be fatal. They can cause immense suffering, but they are heavily genetic, all three of these. And what's very interesting is each one of these three is actually correlated positively with measures of intelligence, of educational attainment, and even of income. And so you look at this, it's severe disorders, in many cases causing quite immense morbidity and mortality, and yet they are positively correlated at the population level with positive things.
So what kind of problems are we talking about? This is stage 3, like love?
I found love was never hard.
What is hard then?
Fitting into a world where most people work differently than you and have different intuitions of what should be done.
So empathy.
It's also aesthetics. When you come into a world where almost everything is ugly and you come out of a world where everything is beautiful. I grew up in a beautiful place and as a child of an artist.
Yeah.
And in this place, it was mostly nature.
Mm-hmm.
Everything had intrinsic beauty. And everything was built out of an intrinsic need for it to work for itself. And everything that my father created was something that he made to get the world to work for himself. And I felt the same thing. And when I come out into the world and I am asked to submit to lots and lots of rules, I'm asking, okay, when I observe your stupid rules, what is the benefit? Mm-hmm. And I see the life that is being offered as a reward. It's not attractive.
What advice would you give to people that have loved ones who suffer from depression? What are they to do?
Okay, now this is really like, man, it's really dark. Here's number one. This is what somebody told me when I lost a friend to suicide, because when you lose a friend to suicide, when you lose a loved one to suicide, you're going to blame yourself. It's in the periphery of suicide, there is a circumference of guilty people who all feel like, oh, if only I'd said this at the right time, if only I'd listened more, if only I'd seen that warning sign, or if only this or that. It's interesting in that with other forms of like disease, if your loved one dies from cancer, say, more than likely you're not going to be thinking like, oh, I should have cured their cancer. It's a tragedy, but at least you're not like, oh, if only I had. You still might think that's part of grief, but
it's not as sticky in many of the other situations. Here, the guilt can really stay for a long time.
Yep. So number one, we're talking about a progressive disease that can lead to death. And if somebody commits suicide, they wanted to commit suicide. And at least what I've been told is you can't happen. It's going to happen. There are no magic words. There's nothing you could do. So people who've lost people to suicide, what I'm talking about. Like, you can watch it happen in real time, and there's just nothing you could do. That being said, being responsive to when it seems like someone's really reaching out for help, and knowing that maybe though it might, especially if it's someone who's like doesn't talk like this a lot of the time, and sentences start coming out of their mouth that if you weren't really paying attention might not seem like a big deal, but for this person it's kind of anomalous that all of a sudden that's happening. Now that's when you can be a good listener and open up to them and hear what they're saying and see like, oh shit, are they asking me is this them asking for help? And even if you're like, I don't know what to do, at least you can like start checking in on them, start like help them understand that you're there for them, and then hopefully get them into therapy, get them to a doctor, get them to a professional who can like see what's going on there, and then there's hope. And even then there might not be hope, actually. Doctors can't stop it. There's no, sometimes that's the way it goes. But, I know that like being sensitive, if somebody's like all of a sudden hitting you up or reaching out to you that normally isn't like that, and just what's going on? How are you? And just listen.
Which in general, depression or not, is probably a good thing to do.
Yeah.
To truly listen. It's like, are you okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Because people have, this whole thing of like cries for help, man. Sometimes they just look like a weird text, and you don't realize that for the person to send that fucking text, they've been thinking about it all morning. They've been just trying to get their phone up from the floor.
It really wasn't until I fully recovered from the second experience of postpartum depression that I realized that I had been suffering on some level my whole life. And I think I always knew, I thought of myself as a very sensitive person, an empathic person. I've been in therapy for 10 years. I knew I had a lot of anxiety. I would never have denied that I had a lot of anxiety. I just didn't realize it crossed over into a disorder really until I was an adult and ended up taking Prozac. I took an SSRI for postpartum, and it was fascinating to me. I ended up interviewing my psychiatrist because I was so fascinated in the whole thing. Once I was on the other side of it, just what I had been through, how different I felt during that period of time, and then how quickly the medication made me feel like myself again. I had come out the other side of the experience of postpartum and was going to start tapering off the medication. And in this window where I no longer had postpartum depression and hadn't yet gone off the SSRI, I realized that life was not only a lot easier than when I had postpartum, but it was easier than it had ever been. And it took taking all of that anxiety away to recognize how much I had been grappling with it my entire life.
You write about creativity and sadness. You practically speaking, how should we leverage sadness for creativity? Is that sort of in the artist domain, in the writer's domain, in the engineering domains, and so on?
It's definitely in those domains, but it's in all domains. We're all going to face pain in this life at some point, and we all have the ability to weather it and withstand it and live with it for a bit, and then try to transform it into something that we find beautiful. And it's very easy to notice the grandeur of like the painting hanging on the gallery wall or the new company that's just been created, but it takes 1,000 different forms, right? You could bake a cake, or like in the wake of the pandemic, we've had more people applying to medical school and nursing school. And after 9/11, you had people applying for jobs as firefighters and teachers. So there's something in the human spirit that takes pain and turns it into meaning when we're at our best. And when we're not at our best, we deny the pain and then take it out on ourselves and on other people. So there's a kind of fork in the road of what to do with it. But we know, I mean, there's all these studies that I go through in the book. Like there was one where the researchers had people watch different movies, like happy movies, sad movies, bittersweet movies. And they found when people watched Father of the Bride, which is like the ultimate bittersweet, you're walking your daughter down the aisle kind of feeling, that was, they would give them creativity tasks after watching these different movies. And the people who had been primed for bittersweetness were the most creative. They were like primed to remember finality, like love and finality, basically. Love and impermanence. There's something about that that gets us to our most beautiful state.
Let me ask, what is meaning? What are we looking for when we engage in the search for meaning?
So when I'm talking about meaning, I'm talking about what's called meaning in life, not the meaning of life. That's some sort of metaphysical claim. Meaning in life are those factors that make people rate their lives as more meaningful, worth living, worth the suffering that they have to endure. And when you study that, what you see is it's a sense of connectedness, connectedness to yourself, to other people, to the world, and a particular kind of connectedness. You want to be connected to things that have a value and an existence independent of your egocentric sort of preferences and concerns. This is why, for example, having a child is considered very meaningful, because you're connecting to something that's going to have a life and a value independent of you. Now, the question that comes up for me, well, there's two questions. One is, why is that at risk right now? And then secondly, and I think you have to answer the second question first, which is, well, yeah, but why is meaning so important? Why is this sense of connectedness so important to human beings? Why, when it is lacking, do they typically fall into depression, potentially mental illness, addiction, self-destructive behavior? And so the first answer I give you is, well, it's that sense of connectedness. And people often express it metaphorically. They want to be connected to something larger than themselves. They want to matter. They don't mean it literally. I mean, if I chained you to a mountain, you wouldn't thereby say, oh, now my life is so fulfilling, right? So what they're trying to convey, they're using this metaphor to try and say they want to be connected. They want to be connected to something real. They want to make a difference and matter to it. And one way of asking them, well, what's meaningful is, tell me what you would like to continue to exist even if you weren't around anymore. And how are you connected to it, and how do you matter to it?
Hakim Bey came up with the idea of something called a temporary autonomous zone, which is that within a structure, a cultural structure, a temporary bubble of freedom will appear that by its nature gets sort of popped by the bigger bubble, or it runs out of resources generally is what happens. So these things will appear just out of the blue that it's almost like, imagine if like on Earth, in some tiny little bit of Earth, the gravitational field was reduced by some percentage, and all of a sudden you could jump really high or whatever, but it wouldn't last. It's like that culturally, all the restrictions and the darkness and the heaviness and all of it. For a second, somehow this bubble appears where humans come together as the hippie ideal, brothers, sisters, just humans, earthlings instead of American, Chinese, Russian, Ukrainian. Temporary autonomous zone, it gets crushed by the default reality that it was appearing in, but somehow within that space, you witness the possibility, the frustrating possibility that anyone who's thought about humanity knows this possibility, which is like, it seems like we can just get along. Like, it does seem like we're pretty much the same thing and that we can just get along.